Usually, when analyzing games, reviewers look at the mechanics and patterns that are most explicit to the user, such as graphics, sound, narrative, and mechanical structures. Some reviewers even tend to provide a score for a game based on these systems. There's nothing inherently wrong with that, since there are many ways to analyze a game. One could almost conclude that the systems that are the most explicit to the user should be the ones that weigh in most in a game's analysis. However, when analyzing games, we must also look into the elements that are so infinitesimally small, most users fail to perceive them, especially when a designer constructs these designs with that in mind. Even if they are almost invisible, the presence of these elements are critical in constructing an elegant design that enhances the overall experience. I have thus decided to make this video in order to elaborate on what these almost invisible patterns are. My goal here is to highlight that a game's design is also a sum of its invisible parts. To help illustrate what I mean by these types of design patterns, let us look at how a magician performs a sleight of hand trick. A sleight of hand is a trick a magician pulls right in front of you, via dragging your attention towards wherever they want you to look at. Once they have control over your attention, the trick unfolds. The key element here is that the user's attention is under direct control by the magician without the audience realizing that that is taking place. When it comes to games, this is something that great game designers do all the time. To exemplify this, let's take a look at Mario 3. As a game, Mario 3 starts out like most do. The game presents the player with some animations, then a title screen, and then some options for the player. Once the player accepts to start the game, we switch over to the hub world. Nothing fancy so far, correct? However, I'm pretty sure that when I paused this video a few seconds ago, your eyesight was in this area of the map. Do you know why? Let's take a look again, but this time in slow motion. The main menu fades out, and then the world fades in, but with a rectangle right in front of it. Notice that the rectangle displaying how many lives Mario has is opaque and centers itself in the middle of the screen. As an object, it dwarfs all other objects visually, thus making sure that it captures the player's attention. The rectangle then magically transforms into a set of spinning stars, which then animate centering themselves over Mario. What happened here is that the rectangle, alongside with the stars, visually caught your attention and then dragged it to wherever it wanted you to look at. A sleight of hand in the game. Why would the game do this? What is the value in dragging the player's eyesight to a specific spot on the game? Quite a lot, actually. Let's take a look at a similar transition, but this time without the described effect. How long did it take you to find Mario on the screen this time? Even if it took you just an extra second, there's an inherent value in guiding the player's attention as a form of experience, since it reduces the game's learning curve. If you're still not convinced, here's another example. Assume for a second that you've never played Mario 3, and that instead you're playing a game called the Green Map of Power. After you press Start, the game transitions from its main menu to a game map. You probably have no idea what this game is about, let alone what you're supposed to do. Now let's say I do a sleight of hand and drag your attention here. Even if you were to press random buttons on the controller, it is easier now to understand the game's mechanics, since the game is subconsciously telling you where to focus your attention. As of consequence, you will learn about the game's design at a faster pace. The visual guide on the world map helps players not only learn about the game, but it also helps guide experienced players as well. Suppose the player has been playing on a level for several minutes and then transitions back to the map by having either beating a level or dying in it. If the player beat the level, the game flips a tile, thus dragging the attention of the player to the right location on the map. If, however, the player died, there's no tile flip, but the game presents Mario in a hovering mechanism to draw the player's attention to the right place. Hence, the players never lost visually on what they need to pay attention to, no matter what happens in the game. Now, how did the later Mario sequels, which also contain hub worlds, handle this sleight of hand? For Super Mario World, when the player beats a level, the world itself changes. This effect not only captures the player's attention, but it also enables them to feel awe as they witness the world morphing right in front of them. Notice also that in the beginning of the game, when there are no changes in the world, you can visually see Mario climbing up to Yoshi's house. This is not just a gimmick effect. It's meant to visually guide the player on where to focus their attention right in the beginning of the game. Meanwhile, although Mario 64 employs sleight of hand effects to help direct the player's attention, it had to literally rewrite the book on how to do it. The reason being that Mario 64 was a 3D game, thus presenting a new challenge to designers. How can you control the player's eyesight when they can directly manipulate the game's camera? The secret was in the combination of level design, Mario's movements, and mechanics. Let's go over them one by one. At the beginning of the game, the Lakitu, which represents the game's camera, appears. It traverses the castle's courtyard, and as it does so, it displays various potential areas to explore for the player. Even if the player doesn't know what's going on, the game is subconsciously displaying to the user various points of interest. Hence, the sleight of hand here is not in holding the player's eyesight into a specific location, but in holding the player's curiosity at bay. Mario 64 does this very subtly, but other games have employed similar techniques in remarkably clever ways. Let's take for example the game Diddy Kong Racing 64. Diddy Kong Racing is a game in which the player must race several different courses in order to beat the game. When the player selects to play a new game, it displays the game's main enemy, the environment, as well as one of its main characters, the genie. After this opening intro, the player's natural progression then is to explore the game. Eventually, they will get an easy-to-capture balloon that is floating by. As it turns out, balloons are what the player needs in order to access each stage in the game. A door blocks each stage with a number symbolizing how many balloons the player must have in order to enter that stage. With the first balloon, the player can then access the first stage, which just requires one balloon. After the player beats that stage, they get a second balloon, which grants access to the second stage. After beating the second stage, the player gets a third balloon, which then grants access to the third stage. Finally, after beating the third stage, the player gets a fourth balloon, which theoretically by this pattern should open up the fourth stage, right? However, the fourth stage requires 5 balloons, not just 4. Therefore, the game stops holding the player's hand and forces them to figure out how to get the 5th balloon. The player then has to head back, explore the island, talk with the genie, change the vehicle into an airplane, maneuver towards the balloon, and then capture it. With the 5th balloon, the player can then access the 4th stage. Let's take a step back here and ask ourselves, why did the designers do this? It seems completely counterintuitive in many ways, since it's breaking the overall flow of the game. Why would the designers force the player to have to embark on a whole side quest just so that they can access the 4th stage? In reality, this whole schema is a clever design trick, since it forces the player to learn the airplane controls in a safe environment. Allowing the player time to learn this mechanic is important, since up to this moment in the game, it was a brand new mechanic. Not surprisingly, the 4th stage is a flight racing stage. Since the player beforehand had to learn the flight controls in order to catch the balloon, the player isn't afraid with having to deal with flight controls all of a sudden. If the game didn't force the player to embark on this mini balloon hunting quest, which forces the player to learn how to fly, their first flight race wouldn't have been fair. All of a sudden, the player would need to face an entire new mechanic that they aren't familiar with, in a challenging environment that is the race. As a result, this would detriment the overall experience the player had with the game. If none of this seems intuitive to you, let's take for example the following game called the Green River of Power. In this game, the player must swim while dodging obstacles such as rocks and sharks. At the end of the first stage, the game greets the player with another swimming stage with more sharks and rocks. At the end of the second stage, the game greets the player with yet another swimming course that they must embark on. On the third stage, the game then presents the player with a rope that they must climb in order to avoid the rising lava. While the player wonders what's going on, the fire catches up with the player and kills him. Even if the player instantaneously spawned at the beginning of the third stage after dying, the player would still be upset. That's because the player didn't have a fair fight, since the mechanics changed faster than they could learn. Hence, a game must make sure that the player has had sufficient time to learn about its core basic mechanics before embarking in an ever more challenging frontier. The balloon side quest is Diddy Kong Racing's sleight of hand, since it tricks the player into learning the flight mechanics before a flight race. Going back to Mario 64, we can see that the game handles the dilemma of teaching mechanics to the player in a similar manner. Notice that the castle courtyard, the location the player starts the game at, is a safe spot. There are no enemies here, only various interesting places to explore, as the Lakitu showed since the beginning. When the player enters the castle's first room, notice that there is a gap between the painting and the floor. This gap forces the player to jump in order to enter the painting. Once entering the painting, the game transports the player into the first level. It might not seem like much, but the castle's courtyard and the game's paintings are clever design tricks because even before entering the very first level in the game, the player has already learned the fundamental building blocks that makes up Mario 64 mechanics: running, jumping, and controlling the camera. Not only does the game's design induce the player to learn its mechanics, its designers also build it to trick the player into looking in the right direction. Let's analyze how in Mario 64 the level starts. As Mario enters a level, notice that he enters it spinning. This is not just an acrobatics aspect, for as Mario spins, he catches the player's attention the same way the spinning stars did in Mario 3. Thus the game emphasizes Mario's location within the screen. Let's look at the same transition this time, but without the spinning effect. Without the game to help us on where to glance at, the player loses grasp on what to focus on, causing a disruption in the player's experience. Take a glance also on how the layout and camera angle for the first stage in Mario 64 was set up. It forces the players to see a road that leads up to a hill with a mountain on the background. This camera shot not only informs the player the direction that they must head on, but their goal for the level. What Mario 64 displays is that a game can leverage the camera perspective, focus, and angle to teach the player on what to do. The game uses the same technique whenever the player enters a room in the castle with a painting in it. The game focuses the camera to make it unambiguous in which area the player should explore. In contrast, in other rooms of the castle in which the camera doesn't set its focus on where the player should go, the player has a greater feeling of discovery as they figure out the room's puzzle. Other games have employed the sleight of hand mechanisms in numerous ways. There is sleight of hand whenever Banjo-Kazooie starts a level, and the fade out effect always highlights the player's position. There is a sleight of hand in Half-Life when the user sees the crowbar for the first time. It's in a narrow corridor which induces the player to be facing the door's glass. Via breaking it, the player then learns that the crowbar can interact with the world. There is a sleight of hand in Warcraft 2 on the first level, since this is the only one in which enemies are stationary until the player finds them on the map. This means that enemy attacks occur only as the user is directly exploring the map. In contrast, in other missions throughout the game, the enemies auto-attack the player in random intervals. These surprise attacks by the enemies aren't considered unfair, since the user has already learned the mechanics of combat in the game at a reasonable pace in the first level. I could keep exemplifying these invisible design patterns for hours, but I hope that with this video I was able to elucidate a bit on what some of them are. Maybe next time when you're playing a game, you'll be able to spot them yourself. I would love to hear your feedback, so feel free to send me an email at daltrey.waters@gmail.com. Also, visit my website www.versus-software.com for more analysis such as this one. Like and subscribe if you like this video. Thanks for watching. Until then, cheers!